What happens when one of television's most outspoken personalities meets a host who refuses to back down from uncomfortable truths? Few could have predicted what unfolded when Whoopi Goldberg sat across from Seth Meyers for what was supposed to be a routine late-night interview. From the moment the cameras started rolling, the tension in Studio AG was unmistakable. What began as casual banter quickly escalated into one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. Before diving into what happened, viewers were urged to subscribe and comment because what followed was a clash no one saw coming. The stage had been set for what producers assumed would be a standard celebrity appearance on Late Night with Seth Meyers. Whoopi Goldberg, fresh off controversial remarks on The View about cancel culture and political correctness, was expected to discuss her upcoming projects and share lighthearted stories from her decades-long career. A segment promoting her latest book had been prepared, following the usual late-night formula. But from the moment Whoopi walked onto the set, something felt off. The warmth typical of celebrity interviews was noticeably absent. She took her seat stiffly, her trademark smile looking forced rather than genuine. Seth, ever the professional, tried to ease the mood with his familiar self-deprecating humor. But Whoopi's responses were short and dismissive. Seth welcomed her enthusiastically and mentioned that she had been making waves recently with her comments about comedy and where the line should be drawn in today's climate. Whoopi's eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle signal familiar to longtime viewers of The View. She shot back that she had been making waves her entire career, adding that it tends to happen when someone has something to say instead of simply reading jokes off cue cards. The audience laughed nervously, unsure whether they were witnessing playful sparring or the beginning of something more serious. Seth maintained his composure, though his jaw tightened briefly. He responded that he writes his own jokes and steered the conversation toward how comedy has evolved, noting that Whoopi had been in the business longer than most people in the room had been alive. She immediately corrected him, pointing out she had certainly been doing comedy longer than he had been alive. Her tone sharpened as she criticized modern comedy, calling it sanitized, watered down, and reduced to bland, inoffensive material that people pretend to enjoy. Sensing a deeper discussion, Seth leaned forward and suggested there might be value in being more thoughtful about the impact words can have. Comedy, he said, has always pushed boundaries, but perhaps comedians should be more conscious about which boundaries they push. Whoopi's response was instant and cutting. She declared that comedy died the moment comedians started worrying more about social media backlash than getting laughs. She accused hosts like Seth of being so afraid of offending anyone that they had forgotten how to take real risks. The studio fell silent. Seth's smile faltered briefly before he recovered. He replied that inclusivity is not the same as fear and argued that comedy can be powerful without being harmful. He emphasized that being funny does not require punching down. That phrase set Whoopi off. She turned towards Seth and criticized the very language he was using, arguing that comedy is being ruined by overanalysis and judgment from people who don't understand genuine humor. The control room grew frantic, unsure whether to cut to commercial, but Seth pressed on. He suggested she was oversimplifying the issue and pointed out that some people use comedy as an excuse to say genuinely hurtful things. He asked whether comedians have a responsibility to consider the impact of their words. Whoopi laughed bitterly. She said her responsibility was to her art, to truth, and to making people think, not to ensuring everyone feels comfortable. Comfort, she added, is what therapy is for. The exchange grew more intense as both leaned forward, their body language signaling that the conversation had gone far beyond typical late-night discourse. Producers gestured urgently from the sidelines, but Seth continued, asking whether she could at least understand why some people might feel excluded or hurt by certain kinds of humor. Once again, Whoopi snapped at the word responsibility. She accused the industry of turning comedy into a moral crusade, where jokes must be approved by sensitivity committees before being allowed to exist. By this point, the audience was completely silent. The familiar rhythm of late-night television setup, punchline, applause had disappeared, replaced by a philosophical battle over entertainment power and social responsibility. Seth took a deep breath and said that with a platform comes influence, and with influence comes responsibility. He argued that entertainers have the ability to shape conversations and affect how people think about important issues. That, according to Whoopi, was the real problem. She accused Seth of having a savior complex and believing himself to be a moral authority. She mocked the idea that his jokes could somehow save the world. The words hit hard. For the first time during the interview, Seth's professional composure completely cracked. His face flushed, and he leaned back as if physically struck. The studio plunged into a heavy silence, broken only by the hum of the cameras, still rolling as they captured every uncomfortable second of a moment that shattered late-night television norms. A savior complex. Seth's voice was tight, barely containing his anger. "Whoopi, I'm trying to have a conversation about basic human decency, and you're turning it into a personal attack. This isn't about me thinking I'm better than anyone. It's about recognizing that words have consequences." Whoopi leaned back in her chair, a satisfied smirk spreading across her face as she watched Seth struggle to regain control. "Oh, please, don't try that wounded, innocent act with me. I've been watching you for years, Seth. Every monologue, every interview, it's the same thing. You always position yourself as the reasonable one, the guy who gets it, who understands modern society better than the rest of us unenlightened masses." The accusation hung heavy in the air. Seth's hands gripped the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. Behind the cameras, producers whispered frantically into their headsets, scrambling to figure out how to salvage what had become a full-blown disaster. The band sat frozen, instruments untouched, watching the confrontation unfold with equal parts fascination and dread. "That's not fair, and you know it!" Seth shot back, his voice rising despite his effort to stay composed. "I've never claimed to have all the answers. But I do believe we can do better than throwing up our hands and saying anything goes when it comes to how we treat each other. Anything goes." Whoopi's voice rose sharply as her restraint finally collapsed. "Seth, I've been fighting for civil rights since before you were even born. I've been on the front lines of social justice movements for decades. Don't you dare lecture me about respect." The audience shifted uneasily, some glancing toward the exits. What had begun as a tense interview now felt deeply personal and potentially damaging to both careers. Seth let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "And yet here you are, defending the right to hurt people in the name of comedy. How does that square with everything you claim to stand for? Because real change doesn't come from tiptoeing around feelings." Whoopi fired back, pointing directly at him. "It comes from confronting uncomfortable truths, from making people squirm, from forcing them to examine their own assumptions. That's what real comedy does. It holds up a mirror and shows society the parts it would rather ignore. So anyone who disagrees with you is just too sensitive to handle the truth," Seth said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Any remaining pretense of politeness was gone. "That's convenient. It means you never have to question whether your truth-telling is just an excuse to be cruel." That landed hard. Whoopi's expression darkened with genuine fury as she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow filled the entire studio. "Cruel. You want to talk about cruel? What's cruel is a generation of comedians so terrified of backlash that they've turned comedy into sanitized, focus-grouped, committee-approved garbage." Seth stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward and catching everyone off guard, including Whoopi. He began pacing behind the desk, hands moving wildly as his composure finally broke. "You know what, maybe you're right," he said sharply. "Maybe I am part of the problem. Maybe I should just say whatever comes into my head and let the consequences fall where they may. Would that make you happy? Would that restore comedy's integrity in your eyes?" "Don't be ridiculous," Whoopi snapped, though something in Seth's tone gave her pause. "No," Seth continued, his voice gaining intensity. "That's exactly what you're saying. You're saying empathy is weakness. That considering how words affect people is the enemy of art. That if someone gets hurt, it's their problem, not ours." Whoopi stood as well, matching his posture. The two now faced each other across the set like gladiators, their professional masks completely gone. "I'm saying art isn't supposed to be safe," Whoopi shot back. "Comedy that doesn't make anyone uncomfortable isn't comedy. It's just pleasant noise that changes nothing. And I'm saying there's a difference between making people uncomfortable and stripping them of their dignity," Seth countered. "There's a difference between challenging ideas and attacking people." The confrontation had reached a fever pitch. Both seemed oblivious to the fact they were on national television, speaking to millions who had tuned in expecting light entertainment and instead witnessed a breakdown in civil discourse. "Dignity," Whoopi said, eyes blazing. What's dignified about pretending offensive jokes are the biggest threat we face, while real injustices go ignored because everyone's too busy policing language. Seth stopped pacing, the accusation hitting him like a physical blow. His face twisted with anger and something close to hurt. That's not fair. You're creating a false choice. We can care about language and still fight bigger battles. Can we? Whoopi replied coldly, because it looks like activism has been replaced with outrage over jokes. It's paralysis disguised as progress. The words hung in the air. Seth's expression shifted, shock, pain, then white fury. His fists clenched as he spoke with surgical precision. Paralysis. You think trying to reduce casual cruelty is weakness? Whoopi threw her hands up in frustration. You're proving my point. You're so focused on words that you've forgotten about real harm. While you're protecting feelings, people are losing homes, dying without health care, facing real discrimination. The studio became a pressure cooker. Crew members stopped working entirely. The audience sat in stunned silence, some recording what they knew was an unprecedented moment. So because bigger problems exist, we should ignore the smaller ones? Seth said bitterly. Let people say anything because someone else has it worse. That's not what I'm saying. Whoopi shouted. When we spend more time debating jokes than fighting for voting rights, we've lost our way. When microaggressions matter more than macro injustices, progress is dead. Seth slammed his hand on the desk, coffee splashing across his notes. Don't you dare question my commitment to real issues. Don't you dare imply that because I believe words matter, I don't care about justice. The outburst only fueled Whoopi. She stepped closer, eyes burning. Then prove it. Stop hiding behind safe comedy. Take real risks. Stop worrying about who you might offend and start worrying about whether you're actually changing anything. I don't need to prove anything to you. Seth shot back, his voice cracking under the strain. I don't need your approval or your validation. I'm doing the work I believe in, the way I believe it should be done. And if that's not good enough for you, then maybe you should find a different show to promote your book on. The mention of the book, the supposed reason for the interview, hit Whoopi like a slap. Her expression shifted from anger to something darker, more personal. My book, she snapped. You think this is about my book? Seth, I've been fighting these battles since before you were born. I've been challenging systems and changing minds while you were still figuring out how to tell a knock joke without offending the door. That jab was the final straw. Seth's face flushed red as he stepped out from behind his desk, closing the distance between them. You know what, Whoopi? You're right. I am younger than you. I haven't been fighting as long as you have. But that doesn't give you the right to dismiss everything I believe in as naive or cowardly. I'm not dismissing it because you're young. Whoopi fired back, matching his aggressive stance. I'm dismissing it because it's wrong, because it betrays what comedy is supposed to be. You're turning art into propaganda and truth into committee-approved talking points. The confrontation reached a breaking point. They stood inches apart, breathing heavily, the air between them crackling with hostility. The studio felt as if it might explode under the weight of their mutual animosity. Seth's voice dropped to a low whisper, carrying more venom than any shout. And you're turning comedy into an excuse for cruelty. You use artistic integrity as a shield to say whatever you want without consequences. That's not brave, Whoopi. That's selfish. The word hit her like a physical blow. She recoiled, her face flashing with shock, then hurt, then pure rage. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak. Then she erupted. Selfish, she screamed. You sanctimonious little worm. You think you can lecture me about selfishness. You've built your entire career on playing it safe, never taking a real risk, serving the same bland, inoffensive pap night after night because you're too afraid to actually challenge anyone. Seth's face drained of color, then flushed again. His hands trembled as he spoke, his voice barely recognizable. Get out. What? Whoopi faltered, confusion briefly replacing fury. I said get out. Seth repeated. Louder now. Get off my stage. Get out of my studio. This interview is over. She stared at him in disbelief. You can't be serious. I'm deadly serious. Seth replied, his voice carrying a finality that surprised even him. You want to talk about integrity, about taking risks. Here's one. I'm ending this interview right now, in front of a live audience, because I refuse to let you use my show as a platform for your toxic worldview. The studio fell into complete silence, Crew members froze, breath held, as if unsure whether they were witnessing reality or some surreal spectacle. Whoopi stood motionless, struggling to process what had just happened. "You're making a mistake," she said finally, her voice quieter but still edged with menace. "You're proving my point. The moment someone challenges your precious sensibilities, you shut them down. That's not courage. That's cowardice." Seth returned to his desk, his movements slow and controlled. "No, Whoopi. Courage is standing up for what you believe in, even when it's hard, even when it makes enemies, even when it means ending an interview with one of the most famous people in entertainment." He turned to the audience, his voice steady and strong. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for what you've witnessed tonight. This is not the kind of show we aim to produce, but sometimes you have to draw a line." Whoopi stared at him for a long moment, fury barely contained. Then, without another word, she ripped off her microphone, tossed it onto the chair, and stormed toward the exit. Her heels struck the floor sharply, each step echoing through the silent studio. At the edge of the stage, she turned back one final time. "You'll regret this, Seth. When your ratings tank because you've turned your show into a safe space for people who can't handle real conversations, remember this moment. Remember when you chose comfort over truth." And with that, she disappeared into the darkness beyond the stage lights, leaving behind a stunned studio and a host standing alone behind his desk. Seth looked out at the audience, his face a mix of exhaustion and resolve. After a long pause, he exhaled and said dryly, "Well, that's definitely not how we planned to end tonight's show." The audience laughed nervously, the sound brittle and uncertain. Seth straightened his tie, gathered his scattered notes, and looked directly into the camera. "We'll be right back," he said, though everyone watching knew nothing would ever be quite the same.